Welcome to tonight's Terror, where you can expect original scary stories. Nothing here is written or narrated by AI. If you enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for visiting, and enjoy the story.
In the spring of my junior year of college, I won a grant to use basically any way I could imagine. After a good deal of futile and outlandish brainstorming, I decided to be pragmatic. Two things were true. I'd never left the Northeast, and I had designs on becoming a professional writer. My plan was going to scratch both itches. I'd travel North America by train and write articles for a local newspaper. I just needed a publication that would take a chance on me. After a few swings and misses, I found a paper small enough and generous enough to indulge me. I gave my most earnest pitch. The chief editor of the Erie Gazette frowned thoughtfully, and after a pause said, "Sounds fun. Let's do it." In retrospect, for a small-town newspaper with a shoestring budget, this might have been an easy project to greenlight. I wouldn't cost them a dime. The grant would cover my travel, and I didn't ask for any pay. At the time, I was just thrilled that someone was going to publish anything I'd written. What exactly that would be, I didn't know. I hoped for some intrigue and adventure along the way. I got that, and a hell of a lot more. After much hand-wringing and dozens of reminders to call often, my parents delivered me to the train station. I shouldered my army green duffel and bounded through the turnstiles. The enthusiasm of my big departure was swiftly arrested by the large digital sign announcing that my train was 90 minutes delayed. I sat on a bench beside my bag near the ticket counter. Dozens of travelers made their way to the sign for arrivals and departures to find the same dispiriting news I had. Eavesdropping would become a favorite pastime on this journey. I quickly learned that passenger trains east of Chicago were perpetually delayed. Apparently, the train company only rented use of the track from the big freight companies. When a freighter needed to get through, the passenger train pulled off and sat. A passenger train running on time in this part of the country was the exception. I tried to keep the positive momentum of the fledgling moments of my adventure. I pulled out my journal and began jotting down anything that came to mind. The look on a station agent's face, the types of luggage people carried, the hum of the industrial floor cleaner as it slid by with a long-faced custodian riding on the back. When the westbound train finally rattled into the station, I sprang up and paced to the gate. I had no idea how long a train would wait in a given station for passengers to deboard and board. My impression of rail travel to this point was largely based on cartoons. If they were any indication, and I hesitated for even a moment, I was sure to find myself sprinting alongside the train and tossing my bag into an open door like a hobo. It turned out I had about 8 minutes. As I moved down the aisle looking for 2 empty seats, no need to make friends just yet, I ran my eyes over the faces of my fellow travelers. It was a compelling mix. Exhausted parents, sleeping toddlers, a handful of people in business dress, a leather-faced cowboy type, and a girl wearing a pink hat who couldn't have been older than 13. I was shocked to see her traveling alone. The ride from my hometown to Chicago was going to take about 11 hours if there were no delays. Big if. I decided to read to pass the time. My plan was to finish a book and then leave it in a coffee shop or restaurant for someone else to find before buying something new. I found the notion of some stranger picking up my well-loved copy of Middlesex and falling in love with Jeff Eugenides very romantic. When I picked my head up, we were beyond the city limits and streaking through suburban towns and the cornfields that separated them. I felt my heart lurch suddenly toward home. It wasn't surprising. I'd never taken a trip as ambitious as this one. 2 months on the road and rails without a companion. I told myself that being alone was a skill that everyone needed. I was just going to learn it all at once. The first noteworthy thing to happen was more sinister than it was interesting, and I was pretty sure my editor wouldn't publish a word of it, but I wrote it down anyway. July 3rd, 2007. The young girl I saw as I boarded sat on the other side of the aisle, about 4 rows ahead of me. Around the time the train stopped in Toledo, she stood and walked tentatively to the end of the car, I assume in search of the restroom. Right away, a man I hadn't noticed before stood and watched as the car door clicked closed behind her. He was heavy-set and bearded. His black t-shirt showed a menacing insignia for something called Deathfall Embrace. I thought it sounded like a Norwegian metal band. He looked up and down the carriage's empty aisle before leaving his seat and striding confidently to the space the girl had just vacated. I watched, incredulous, as he picked up her bag, a dark blue Jansport backpack. He planted himself in the seat the bag had occupied and placed it on his lap. As I waited for the girl's return, I cycled through the myriad harmless reasons for what I was seeing. Were they traveling together? Did an angsty teen not want to sit with her father? Her uncle? He had the look of an uncle, at best. If only I could get this published, I'd have an excuse to use my favorite adjective in the English language, avuncular, relating to or in the manner of an uncle. It amused me endlessly that our dictionary held such a specific and nearly useless word. I was torn from my reverie by the shunk of the car door. The girl in the pink hat stepped back in and proceeded down the aisle. Her gaze was down on the gravel-colored, rubbery floor of the train car. Like all of us, she was careful of her footing while the train lurched and shook down the track. When she arrived at her seat, her eyes rose with dreadful slowness over the man who held her bag. Her expression was at first amused, but this was quickly replaced by panic. Her eyes grew wide, and she took a half step back as his hand shot up, seemingly to detain her there beside him. I heard him murmur something in a low, patronizing voice. It might have been, "Just sit. I need some company." His arm floated out into the aisle toward the girl's midsection. I assumed the other arm was still crossed through the strap of her blue bag. I liked to think I was about to spring into action and place myself between the girl and the Norwegian metal man. Before I could, assuming I would, an old woman was suddenly standing behind the girl. She wore a knit sweater and burgundy pants that fastened cartoonishly high above her waist. When she spoke, I remember thinking her voice sounded like a lunch lady I knew in my grammar school cafeteria. She was kind when she wanted to be, and petrifying when she needed to be. "Come sit with me now, sweetie," the woman said. The girl tilted her head up to see above her pink hat's brim. The old woman smiled gently, and the girl gave a subtle nod. Then, the woman fixed her eyes coldly on the hulking man in the seat. "Thank you for looking after our bag. I'll have it now." The way she said "our" told me that she'd never met this kid before, but had the good instincts to know when someone needed help. I let out a breath I'd been holding for I don't know how long when the man surrendered the bag without complaint. Once the teenager had her bag in her hands, she began walking down the aisle toward my row. I heard the old woman turn and speak to the man as she began to follow. "Why don't you take a walk off the caboose, cretin?" Without a word, the man stood and stormed off to the end of the car in the direction of the restroom. The girl and her new grandmother walked silently past, and I offered a sad smile of commiseration. I saw a mother holding a baby nod knowingly to the old woman. While I wasn't proud that a senior citizen half my weight had the guts to step in and I didn't, I had learned my first lesson of train travel. Watch out for creeps, and when in doubt, sit with a sweet old lady. A bell chimed from a quarter-sized speaker above my head. Outside, a similar tone sounded on the platform. A warning to those stretching their legs or smoking that the train would leave momentarily. A clutch of stragglers dashed through the door seconds before it closed. The leg of our journey from central Ohio to the Windy City would take another 4 hours. All of them would be spent in the dark. The sun had set, and only a pink stripe of light remained, wrapping the horizon as the train pulled away from the platform and gained speed. I looked across the aisle and found a new companion. A middle-aged man with white flecks in the hair of his sideburns sat with his eyes closed. His head was pitched back, as if he were falling asleep, or in deep contemplation of some weighty conundrum. A row behind him sat the old woman in the beige knit sweater and the teenage girl, now engrossed in her folio of CDs. Her pink hat was gone, and the ponytail of blonde hair made her look even younger. I shook my head as I thought of the creep in the black t-shirt. The scene that had unfolded half an hour before had set me on edge, and reminded me that I was alone, among strangers. The conductor entered the car through the sliding door ahead. I looked up to offer a polite smile when I realized I'd been clenching my jaw. If I didn't see that cretin, as the old woman had dubbed him, for the rest of the trip, it would be a relief. Perhaps he'd deboarded in Toledo. The conductor paused between me and the man with the closed eyes. "Tickets, please," he said brightly. My neighbor's eyes sprang open at the sound of the conductor's voice. He turned and looked up with a mischievous smile. As the conductor reached down for the ticket in my hand, my neighbor spoke. "Jimmy!" he crooned. "Right on time. Lovely to see you again. What has it been? A year?" The conductor sighed and returned my ticket, now bearing a horseshoe-shaped hole from his silver punch tool. "More like a day, I think," the conductor replied. "What have you been up to since this time yesterday, Daniel?" "Oh, just lying around," Daniel said. His eyes were closed again. The conductor plucked Daniel's ticket from his armrest and punched it without even looking. He turned and caught my incredulous stare. "Oh, he's a regular. He's ridden this route so many times they're going to name it after him," the conductor said. "God, I hope not," Daniel said with a snort. He glanced at his wristwatch. "Would you look at that, Jimmy? It's getting to be that time." His gaze drifted to the window. "And that place, no?" The conductor stopped smiling. "I think you know it is." Apparently finished with the interaction, he turned and moved on to the young girl and her new companion, the old woman who I'd begun referring to as Dorothy. On the Golden Girls, I thought Dorothy was the really tough and sassy one. My neighbor, Daniel, peeked one eyelid open and caught my eye. He nodded. An opening! I spoke for the first time since boarding the train hours before. "What was all that about?" "What's that, old sport?" he shot back. "What did you mean? We're getting to that time and that place." "Oh, that. It's just this stretch of track we'll hit soon. There was a bad accident there a few years ago. Derailment. A lot of folks died. A lot more hurt. Nasty stuff." I wore an intrigued frown. He continued. "Anyway, Jimmy, he's our faithful conductor. He always gets in a mood when we cross over the death patch." "The death patch," he said with a bounce of his eyebrows. "I call it that to rattle him. He hates it," Daniel said with a note of satisfaction. "Whoa. Do you think anyone here was in that wreck?" I asked, already reaching for my journal and pen. My journalistic insights were all of 8 hours old, but I felt there was a story in the air. "These people?" Daniel looked both ways with comic exaggeration. "What do you think? Would anyone who'd been through that willingly ride this train? Right, fair enough, I agreed, my face stinging with embarrassment. Daniel closed his eyes again and tilted his head back. Mangled bodies, severed bits, he murmured, in the husky tones of a man falling asleep. I didn't want to lose this, my only connection to a stranger on the train, so I pressed my luck. When did this happen? I asked. He opened his eyes and leaned forward with a sigh, giving up on sleep for the moment. I don't know. Doesn't much matter. Suffering, chaos, death. Isn't that every day? He cleared his throat with a bark. Listen, kid, if you're going to keep me awake, you're going to keep me company. He pulled a flask from the breast pocket of his jacket. It was bound in soft brown leather and stitched at the seams. He unscrewed the silver cap and held it out across the aisle. I was about to reach for it when my mother's face flashed in my mind. You first, I said, proud of myself for not simply acquiescing to drinking an as yet unidentified liquid from a perfect stranger's flask. I doubted my mother would have shared in that pride. So paranoid, Daniel scoffed. It's whiskey. Of a sort. And anyway, we could all be dead on the tracks within the hour. Live a little. I held his gaze for a moment longer. He rolled his eyes with exasperation and then took a long pull from the flask. After swallowing with a little grimace, he thrust the flask back into the aisle with a flourish and asked, So, do I look dead? I took the flask and tilted it toward my lips, careful to not let it touch my skin. I'd endured plenty of bottom-shelf whiskey in my short tenure as an adult, but this tasted like it had been siphoned from the floor of a machine shop. Too foul, even for the bargain bin. The liquor hit my throat like hot oil, slick and choking. It plunged into my gut with the grace of a thrown brick. My body instantly rebelled. I tried to mask the shock, tightened my jaw, steadied my eyes, but it was no use. My face twisted, and a fit of coughing overtook me. Daniel watched, his eyes narrowing as I rode out the last stinging seconds of the aftershock. I forced a tight-lipped smile and handed the flask back. Thanks, I said meekly. So, Daniel looked at me with mischief in his smile. Do you want to hear a scary story? Before I could answer, the floor vanished beneath me. My feet lifted, my vision smeared, and I plunged backward through the seat into an impossible blackness. Then, nothing. I must have blacked out or fallen into some kind of dream. When I opened my eyes, I was still on the train. Same carriage, same seat, but everything was cloaked in shadow, as if the lights had dimmed and time had slipped. Train car was soaked in murky blue light, the kind that floods the world an hour before sunrise in the summertime. I turned to the window and watched as the moon sailed past at an impossible speed, slipping out of view in the west, only to reappear seconds later in the east, repeating its arc like a record stuck in a loop. When I turned, I felt resistance. My limbs moved as if submerged in thick syrup, every gesture slow and strained. Daniel still sat beside me, staring ahead, his face set on neutral. What time is it? I asked. He turned with the same sluggish motion, glancing down at his wrist. See for yourself, he said, and began unfastening the watch. In the dream, if this was a dream, it didn't strike me as strange at all that he would hand it to me rather than read the time off his watch himself. But as the clasp came loose, his entire hand dropped from his wrist and hit the floor with a soft, wet thump. I recoiled as Daniel lifted his wrist, revealing a gaping wound where his hand should have been. Disgust churned in my throat. But it wasn't just a hole, it was alive. Blinking hard, I forced my eyes to focus through the haze of horror. The wound teemed with shining white maggots, writhing and slipping from a pulsing mass of gore where his hand had been. Daniel raised his eyebrows in mild surprise. "Getting started early tonight, I see. I'd better be off." Before I could speak, he rose and stalked off down the aisle toward the train's rear. I twisted in my seat and peered after him. He didn't look back. His left arm spat another shower of maggots as he awkwardly wrestled the sliding door open with his right. With great effort, I stood and knelt backward on my seat. I could see the scattering of other passengers I'd boarded with. They all sat bolt upright, with that slack, impassive face Daniel had worn. I saw Dorothy and the teenage girl beside her. No recognition of me or the grotesque scene that had just unfolded was evident on their faces. Behind me, at the front of the car, I heard the sliding door pull open. I turned and saw the Norwegian death metal man lumbering down the aisle toward me. The sharp edges of his sneer were gone. He looked like a man heading into a 12-hour shift in the coal mines, hopeless, exhausted. He noticed me and slowed as he passed. "What are you doing up?" he grumbled, without pausing beside me for a response. Growing bold and morbidly curious, I looped my bag strap over my shoulder and stepped into the aisle. I think some part of me was still hoping to write a story about all this. He wasn't moving fast, and it didn't take me long to close the space between us. We were in the next car by the time I'd caught up to him. My motion was looser now, more natural. Each moment I'd spent in this dreamscape seemed to allow me greater facility with my own movements, breaking free from the heavy air that slowed me before. If the big man in the black t-shirt noticed me behind him, he didn't acknowledge it. Each car we passed through was entirely empty. At the end of each one, he'd flip the door handle and heave the sliding door aside in a single motion. The train seemed to be gaining speed now, the sound of the track cracking beneath us as we reached the final car. I suppose that's called the caboose, but it looked much the same as the others. Empty, still. The death metal man approached the door at the end of the car and paused. There was nowhere left to go. I expected the door to be locked, but it wasn't. I watched, frozen, as he yanked it open in an instant. A flood of sound poured in. The fierce roar of the wind, the keening clatter of the wheels on the tracks. Overwhelming and wild. I ducked my head in shock, clutching the headrest of an upholstered seat. Without a glance back, he stepped through the doorway and vanished onto the platform outside. A muffled crunch echoed. Then only the scream of the wheels remained. I didn't think. I dashed to the open door and looked out, but it was too late to see anything. The track raced by below as I held tightly to the corrugated metal, the doorframe. In a sudden jolt of panic, I realized the danger I was in and staggered backward, collapsing onto the floor. The door, no longer held in my grasp, slid shut with an eerie slowness and clicked into place. Instantly, the wind died, the noise vanished, and the car fell into a suffocating silence. I propped myself up, hands pressed to the rubberized aisle floor, stared at the closed car door, and thought of what to do. Run for the conductor? Was there a panic button in here someplace? Then, I heard the door at the head of the car slide open, and urgent footsteps approached. I craned my neck and looked up to see Jimmy, the conductor. "This way, folks. Let's get on with it," he called. I blinked, trying to make sense of this cryptic remark. But before I could ask anything, he was standing over me. His face was empty of the affable charm he'd worn earlier. "You'll need to get up now," he said. His voice had changed. Flatter, deeper, clear the aisle. I hesitated, my eyes flicking from Jimmy to some dark shapes that had gathered behind him. "Sir," he repeated, "stand up." I did. He gestured sternly for me to follow. I slung my duffel bag over one shoulder and stepped out into the aisle. "Leave the bag," he snapped, and I obeyed without thinking, dropping it into a vacant seat. He turned and walked to the back of the car, and I followed in his wake. I stole a look back and saw a line of passengers, gray-faced and unblinking. At the very rear of the car was a bench of seats facing backward, the kind I had only seen in diagrams and children's books. I hadn't realized they still existed. It spanned the full width of the car on either side of the aisle and had seatbelts with shoulder straps, which struck me as odd on a train. The conductor gestured sharply. "Sit." I lowered myself onto the middle of the bench, uncertain, and beginning to feel a crackle of panic under my ribs. "Buckle up," he said. The command was final and absolute. I pulled the straps over my shoulder and looked down at the buckle between my thighs, not thinking about what I was doing. It was more like a seatbelt you'd wear on a roller coaster. "What's going on?" I asked. My voice sounded meek and thin. "Now," he said, and I did it. The click of the seatbelt was absurdly loud in the silent car. Then the conductor moved toward the door at the rear, beside the bench, and threw a lever I hadn't noticed. There was a deep, metallic clunk. Something mechanical and heavy unlatched. And the rear door slid open twice as wide as it had before, and stayed there. I gasped as the sudden open space revealed nothing but dark track and the bellowing windswept night. The clack and snap of the wheels on the rails sounded infinite, like it was echoing through a canyon that didn't exist until just now. Then I heard footsteps. The passengers, one by one, silent and blank-faced, as if answering a cue that only they could hear, began walking single file to the rear of the train. The cowboy with the leathered face was first. He paused beside the open doorway, turned as if listening to something out of sight, then stepped cleanly off into the void. A sickening thunk sounded over the wind. Then the mother with the baby, only now the baby was gone. Her arms were empty. She walked stiffly, her eyes forward, and vanished off the edge. I tried to look away, but a smear of red caught the periphery of my vision as she fell. The businesswoman I'd seen flipping through a binder, a college-age kid in a baseball hat, a woman with a tote bag shaped like a turtle, all of them filing past me like penitents, and then disappearing. Each death was instantaneous, but different. Cowboy's neck snapped as his body hit the ballast. The businesswoman seemed to be pulled beneath the wheels. The kid in the baseball hat simply vanished in a flash of crimson that dissipated instantly, like mist. I screamed. I screamed so hard I tore my throat raw, but no one responded. Not the conductor, who now stood beside the door, clipboard in hand. Not the passengers, whose eyes never even flicked to me as they marched forward. And then I saw the girl with the pink hat. She was clutching her CD folio to her chest, her lip trembling. Behind her, the old woman followed, more composed but just as pale. "No," I shouted. "Stop, please, don't." But the girl carried on. Her steps were robotic, as though something greater than herself had seized the controls. She looked at me as she passed. Her eyes were vast, terrified pools. Then she stepped into the darkness. I thrashed in my seat, the belt biting into my hips and shoulders, but it wouldn't give. The old woman followed the girl, her expression somber, as if this was a duty. She paused beside me and nodded to the empty space the girl had occupied before falling. "For some of us, it never gets any easier," she said solemnly. Her eyes met mine just before she passed through the door. I squeezed my eyes shut. Soon, I felt Jimmy, the conductor's hand, on my shoulder and opened my eyes. He looked down at me with an unreadable expression. "Your stop is coming up. Don't miss it. I can't go any farther with you." He hugged the clipboard to his chest and stepped out into the devouring dark. He was the only one who seemed to bounce. After the fall, his body sprang up, curled in on itself, unnatural and weightless. But I saw his face, twisted, a wild, unbearable mask of pain. I closed my eyes again and thrashed my head back and forth, trying to erase the image from my mind. Suddenly, the roar of the wind and track was gone. After a long moment, I forced myself to look. Ahead of me was the folded tray table of a seat back. I was in my original seat. I reached for the bulky shoulder straps and found only the flannel of my shirt. Was it over? Was I awake again? The train was slowing now. I looked outside and saw the moon, hanging in place, unmoving. I ventured a look around the car and found it empty. I was the only passenger left. Outside, a sign slid by slowly enough that I could read it. Union Station. We'd reached Chicago. I fumbled for my phone and saw the time. We were arriving on schedule, more or less. The speaker above my head crackled, and a voice, not Jimmy's, announced that the disembarking passengers should exit to the platform on the right. I took a hasty inventory of my possessions and gathered them on my lap. I was going to get off this train the moment it stopped. As it slowed to a crawl, I glanced out the left side windows, across the aisle. On the far platform, a crowd was already gathering. Embarking passengers, pressing forward, waiting to board a train headed back east. I stood and moved up the aisle, steadying myself on each headrest. Outside, the figures grew clearer as the train crept forward. Then I saw them. They were all there. The old woman, the girl in the pink hat, the man in the black t-shirt, even the conductor. My companions, lined up among the crowd, waiting. Their faces were pale, drawn, their eyes fixed on the ground. Somehow, impossibly, they were here, waiting to get on a train headed east. They were whole again, not a sign of the gore that painted the tracks back there. I was certain it was them. They all looked sadder, though, stooped and staring into nothing. I looked away and dashed out onto the platform the moment the doors opened. The hiss of the train chased me as I sprinted for the station's glowing interior. I hunkered in Chicago for a week, desperately trying to explain away the events of the first leg of my journey. When I returned to the station, I watched 4 trains come and go without getting on. In the end, I tore up my rail pass and rented a car. As for what I saw, there was nothing to do. No chance the newspaper back home would publish something like that. So I thought I'd tell you, before I start pretending, even to myself, that it never happened.